As Congress heads back to work, we investigate the growing anger and the growing divide.
Politicians are selfish people. They're never going to do what's not in their best interest.
See how the parties pulled so far apart and how politicians stack the deck.
And we have gerrymandered districts to protect incumbents on Republican and Democratic sides.
You know who's going to win.
And we'll examine the president's threat to shut down the government and plans to cut taxes in Congress. We'll go one-on-one with Senator Marco Rubio. Plus, we have computer models that show what would happen if a storm like Hurricane Harvey struck Tampa Bay. This is Money, Power, and Politics. We have a lot of ground to cover as usual, but first I want to take a moment to thank all of you for helping us to reach another milestone. We launched the pilot of our show on Labor Day weekend 2 years ago. And that is why today, with a humble heart, I am proud to announce a show called Money, Power, and Politics. Since then, we've traveled across the nation through a blizzard in Iowa, followed the presidential candidates from start to finish, took the show on the road nightly from Cleveland and Philadelphia, and kept going nightly for more than 6 months. We took our show on the road to Cuba for a week, and last year our team picked up 7 Emmy Awards along the way. So thank them, all of you, as well, for helping us reach tonight's milestone. And on this holiday, for those of you who may be watching us for the first time, I also want to take a moment to explain what this show is all about. First, we investigate the maddening contradictions in government, from our drug laws. Who is your dealer?
Uncle Sam is my supplier. The epitome of hypocrisy and stupidity.
To our food labeling laws. So you have to inject additives into an all-natural product in order to call it all-natural.
Yes.
We also find wasted tax money and ask the politicians who done it. Just a dead-end road.
Yeah, dead-end road with a gate on it.
Do you know who slipped in that road to nowhere? Do you know who did it?
No, I said that's a new thing to me.
We put politicians from both parties to the test, and we like to mix it up as well with some humor and satire. I'd like to read a quote from a special guest in our gallery tonight. Help me. The couple next to me won't stop talking about your show, and it's boring me out of my mind. On that note, last year for Labor Day, we put together a little parody skit.
Welcome to Money, Power, and Politics.
Are we going to stop this?
That was a whole medley.
Oh it was an audition to see who would play me while I was off for the Labor Day holiday. Our director, Darren, didn't make the cut.
That bad?
It's just rubbish.
It was the Labor Day show. That's the whole thing. It was the Labor Day show. I mean, I know Craig's the guy. I realize that, but this would have been my chance to fill in. The viewers, they probably wouldn't have minded, and I was convinced of it. So, well, I guess not. So I thought I did. Hey, how are you? It sounds a lot like him. Yeah, but apparently not.
But this year, this Labor Day weekend calls for something very different and something far more serious, given the serious problems we have in Washington and the crisis with North Korea and the disaster in Texas and the threats of another government shutdown from the White House. We're facing some very big challenges, and our politicians are divided and gridlocked as ever. So before we bring in Senator Marco Rubio, we want to take a good, hard look at how we became so divided and when and how our nation pulled apart. It started long before the Obama and Trump administrations. That's tonight's Spotlight.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
President Trump often speaks in what he calls truthful hyperbole, or what he would call harmless exaggeration. But his quip about shooting someone would have carried a very different meaning in our nation's early years, when a vice president shot and killed our first Secretary of the Treasury, when many politicians settled their differences with gun or sword duels. Even a young Abraham Lincoln once agreed to a duel. And when a politician was beaten in Congress, they literally meant beaten in Congress.
There is precedent for a senator being beaten with a cane.
Fast forward to the 1960s, politics still got pretty rough, especially at the national conventions.
I'm sorry to be out of breath, but somebody belted me in the stomach.
So we cannot romanticize yesteryear. There never was a golden age of civility in American politics.
I think we've got a bunch of thugs here.
There is an awful mess in the aisle here.
But through the years, politicians figured out how to disagree without being disagreeable. And that age of respect and relative civility peaked in the 1980s with President Ronald Reagan and House Speaker Tip O'Neill.
A little kidding is, after all, a sign of affection, the sort of things that friends do to each other. And Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful you have permitted me in the past, and I hope in the future, that singular honor, the honor of calling you my friend.
One of the finest moments of government was 1983. Social Security was within 6 months of going bankrupt. 2 old Irishmen, one named Ronald Reagan and another one named Tip O'Neill, they decided that they were going to solve this problem. And that was one of the stellar examples of government in crisis coming together in a bipartisan way.
Listen to how President Reagan spoke of his arch rival on Capitol Hill and compare it to how politicians speak of their arch rivals today.
I think the fact of our friendship is testimony to the political system that we're part of and the country we live in. A country which permits 2 not so shy and not so retiring Irishmen to have it out on the issues rather than on each other or their countrymen.
Well, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan are a case study on respect. They both had completely opposite views in some areas. They were both patriots. They both loved the country. They both knew what it took to defend this country. They had discussions, they have frequent discussions. At the White House, they had dinners, they had whiskeys, they had all kinds of discussions, and they were able to accomplish great things from this country. I don't believe that has happened in the past 10 years.
It has not, because voters and federal lawmakers have pulled apart for a lot of reasons. We'll start in the 1980s, because while civility may have peaked in the Reagan years, that's also when both parties developed a gender gap. President Reagan lost ground with women, and he gained ground with men on policy.
It is time to check and reverse the growth of government, which shows signs of having grown beyond the consent of the governed.
Reagan focused his race on making the military bigger and most of the rest of our government smaller.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
That attracted men who statistically place a higher value on national defense and self-reliance, and it turned away women who statistically favor a more active government for several reasons.
Women deserve equal pay for equal work.
For example, women statistically earn less than men, so they tend to favor more government intervention to address that. And women who make up a big part of the health and education workforce tend to favor more government help in those professions.
I've always felt the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
And as that gender gap widened, the 2 main parties also pulled apart. Conservative Democrats like Zell Miller turned on their party as it moved to the left.
I wish we lived in the day where you could challenge a person to a duel.
And progressive Republicans like Charlie Crist left their party as it moved to the right.
I'm running as a Republican. As an independent, I can't tell you how comfortable I am as a Democrat.
Republicans used to have a big moderate and liberal wing in the Northeast and in California, and Democrats used to have a big moderate or conservative wing in the South. That helped balance the parties and naturally moderated our politics. But as the gender gap took hold and the country was rocked by President Clinton's sex scandal and impeachment, and then a divisive and unpopular war under President George W. Bush, both parties lost one of their wings and pulled harder to the right and harder to the left. And as that happened, each party began to dominate different regions of the country, which gave them more power to draw their state's election maps and manipulate the congressional districts to their advantage.
Now, what has changed over the years is the gerrymandering of congressional districts so that you have a predetermined outcome before the November election. You know who's going to win.
Well, that goes back more than 200 years to a man named Elbridge Gerry. To reward his party, he signed a law to redraw the districts of Massachusetts. And one of them was so rigged and squirmy, critics said it looked like a salamander, so they mockingly called it a Gerrymander, and over time, gerrymander. It came to describe the way politicians stack their districts with voters from one party or the other to keep their districts safe. And both parties have done an awful lot of stacking in the past 20 years.
It is in part because we have a closed primary system and we have gerrymandered districts to protect incumbents on Republican and Democratic sides, which for 20 years has led Republicans and Democrats to realize their path to getting reelected is to cater only to their base and to speak down to the other side, because otherwise they'll be primaried for not being a good enough Republican or Democrat.
Moderate, which by definition means keeping reasonable limits, became a dirty word in politics.
Dewhurst has served as a moderate Republican.
Meanwhile, the U.S. Supreme Court opened the floodgates to big money. Now special interests can spend unlimited cash smearing candidates they don't like.
Now the unhinged left is endorsing and applauding shooting Republicans. When will it stop? It won't if John Ossoff wins on Tuesday.
I honestly believe that the bulk of the vitriol that you hear in politics today is predicated by special interest groups who have stuff at stake. So, and it doesn't matter if it's left or right. All the groups are entrenched. They're fighting for their territory, and they've moved in the last 20 years to these scorched earth policies.
And as money got more and more of a chokehold in elections, politicians spent more and more time raising money and less time getting to know one another in Washington, and gridlock set in.
Too many legislators are overly beholden to the special interests, and that's got to change. Politicians are selfish people. They're never going to do what's not in their best interest. We've seen that over and over.
Vote these people out.
Voters have been fed up for years.
Dysfunctional, dishonest,
inept. But as they try to change course, they may have overcorrected by pushing out experienced dealmakers like Indiana Senator Dick Lugar and replacing them with mavericks who ran on fighting for change.
We will not compromise.
But the more they fought, the less they changed.
Object. That side's already made up his mind. This side has already made up its mind.
And so in both parties, the art of compromise and even the meaning of bipartisanship was lost.
Bipartisanship means they have to come our way.
If you're against it, then get out of the way. Just get out of the way.
And next week, we'll show you how the tension and conflict accelerated under Presidents Obama and Trump. And meanwhile, two of our guest contributors have launched a bipartisan statewide tour. Former Congressman David Jolly and Patrick Murphy will host a town hall to explain why gridlock rules Washington and how we can solve it. That'll take place at USF in Tampa on Tuesday, September 12th at 7 p.m. in the Marshall Student Center. But tonight, we're focusing the rest of our show on the big decisions now facing Congress and the disaster in Texas. Senator Marco Rubio joins us when we come back. As our nation focused on helping the people of Texas after Hurricane Harvey, North Korea fired a missile into Japanese airspace, escalating a crisis with a dictator who has threatened nuclear war and a preemptive attack on the U.S. territory of Guam.
Well, it does look a little as if this is the Guam plan that the North Koreans talked about, except they just changed the trajectory and sort of fired it north rather than south, to be crude about it. This is the headache that just won't go away, the migraine that won't go away.
Meanwhile, the president is facing more headaches over the Russia investigation. The New York Times and Washington Post revealed a Trump business aide tried to work a Trump Tower deal with the Russian government during the presidential campaign. And the president's approval ratings continue to slide. There's the 538.com chart that shows how he's losing ground from week to week. Well, the president did fire up his base by pardoning Joe Arpaio, but he may have turned off some others by saying that he announced it as Hurricane Harvey took aim on Texas to capitalize on ratings.
Actually, in the middle of a hurricane, even though it was a Friday evening, I assumed the ratings would be far higher than they would be normally.
Meanwhile, we still have a lot to discuss with our next guest, Senator Marco Rubio, because as Congress tackles a possible debt default and tax reform, an aid to the victims of Hurricane Harvey, the president has also threatened to shut down the government if he does not get the money he wants to wall off our border with Mexico.
We need the wall very badly. As you know, Mexico has a tremendous crime problem, tremendous. One of the number 2 or 3 in the world. The wall will stop much of the drugs from pouring into this country and poisoning our youth. So we need the wall. It's imperative.
Well, Senator Rubio, thank you so much for joining us here in studio.
Thank you.
Do you really think President Trump would shut down the government if he does not get the money he wants for that border wall?
Well, I think he campaigned on the border wall.
I mean, he said it over and over again. I was there a lot of those times that he was going to build a wall. It's a campaign promise that I believe he intends to keep, and that, quite frankly, it's a goal that I generally support. But that said, I don't think we're going to have a government shutdown. But the president comes from the world of business, where you strike a position kind of far from where you think you're going to wind up in order to line yourself to negotiate. And sometimes that works well in business, and sometimes that works well in politics, sometimes it doesn't. Our goal is not to shut down the government. I'm not in favor of that, and we'll work very hard to keep that from happening.
North Korea has threatened us repeatedly with nuclear attacks. The president has warned of retaliation, fire, and fury. You said in the campaign the president can't be trusted with nuclear codes. Do you still have that concern in light of the threats that are flying back and forth?
I'm not concerned about any sort of U.S. miscalculation. He's got really good people around him, too, by the way. I don't know about the president of North Korea. I mean, he's a lunatic, but I think he's not so crazy that he doesn't realize that any armed conflict with the United States would be one that he would lose and could potentially be the last day of his life, and most certainly the last day of his regime.
When I look at Afghanistan, I think back to that debate you and I did with George Stephanopoulos a few years ago. There was a moment when you just sucker punched Kendrick Meek when he did not understand the difference between a plan and a goal.
How about an idea of standing up for the middle class? I mean, you and Charlie Crist, you speak. What is not creating jobs? Not a plan.
That's not a plan.
Allowing individuals.
That's a goal.
A goal.
John McCain and others are raising that same concern about the White House not having a strategy in place instead of just a statement of goals. Is there a strategy for Afghanistan that goes along with this increase in troop levels?
So I believe it is. I think the president has said that he's not going to outline. He's not going to tell the enemy how many people he's going to send, or he's not going to telegraph what the methods are. I can tell you that General Mattis at the Department of Defense has a plan, but he's not going to put it in a press release. And I see some wisdom in that. It's unorthodox and it's different, but there's some wisdom. The goals are important. The goal of the previous administration was to withdraw from Afghanistan by a date certain and to hit certain troop targets. The goal of the Trump administration is to defeat ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and any other elements in that region that pose a threat to our national security. How they're going to do that, they're not going to telegraph it, but I know for a fact that there is a plan to achieve it.
On tax reform, you've called for expanding the child tax credit, paid family leave, nixing the marriage penalty. These things would pass, would they not, if it came up for a vote? Bipartisan, would that not pass?
You would hope so.
You would hope so. So why don't we just bring those things up for a vote instead of a very complicated, perhaps burdensome process of broader tax reform?
Well,
those points would pass.
It would be impossible to do tax reform without those components in it. And there's already going to be an effort to do broad tax reform. And I think we need to do broader tax reform, by the way. I think they're interrelated. I mean, one of the best things you can do to help working families is to increase the per-child tax credit. The other thing you can really do to working families is get the economy growing so they have better paying jobs. So they're actually making more money, not just keeping more money.
Let's close with a prediction. We'll play it back at the end of the year. What is the likelihood that we will have tax cuts and tax reform in place by the end of this year?
Well, I think we have a very good chance. I can't give you a percentage. I think it makes all the sense in the world for this country to do it. There are a lot of pieces of tax reform that should be a part of it. I think the only way tax reform fails, quite frankly, is if my colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle decide that denying the president a victory, a policy victory, would help them in the 2018 midterms or the 2020 presidential race. And, you know, Republicans have done that too in the past, but I hope that at least on this topic we can avoid that and get enough people to cross the aisle to vote for it.
Senator Rubio, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, coming up, the disaster in Texas and computer models that put it in context. We'll show you what would have happened if Hurricane Harvey had hit Tampa Bay. Well, what would happen if a storm like Hurricane Harvey struck Tampa Bay? We have some computer models now that put this in context.
Our garage is flooded. Our whole first floor is flooded. It's like, that's crazy.
Hurricane Harvey swamped entire neighborhoods around Houston and drove rooftop evacuations that may remind you of Hurricane Katrina.
We are seeing catastrophic flooding.
It turned the streets into boat channels and left thousands of families to sleep in gas stations or trudge through waist-high water to get to a shelter.
They're completely soaked. I mean, I don't even know what to say.
So you see why the FEMA director said we haven't seen anything quite like this.
But you couldn't draw this situation up.
And believe it or not, it could have been as bad, if not worse, if a hurricane like Harvey struck Tampa Bay. You wouldn't even see the roof. A USF study once showed that if a major hurricane hit North Pinellas County, MacDill Air Force Base would get swamped in 13 feet of water. Thousands of homes in Tampa would see the same kind of flooding we've seen in Houston, and we've known this for years.
Where my cursor is going around is the USF campus.
10 years ago, the Pinellas property appraiser developed simulations for Pinellas. This is St. Petersburg after a Category 1 hurricane. The model shows that it also puts much of Dunedin underwater. Reddington Shores gets it from both sides. And when you bump it up to a Category 2 hurricane, most of Reddington Shores gets flooded. Dunedin gets swamped, and flooding sweeps to Bayfront Tower in St. Petersburg. Move up to a Category 3 storm, and it takes out 4th Street in St. Petersburg. And those white squares or specks are all we can see of the Old Southeast. The model also shows a Category 4 storm would flood the interstate in Tropicana Field. A Category 5 turns the whole downtown blue, and much of the interstate and other major streets go underwater, just as we've seen this week in Texas. Coming up, we'll take a closer look at the disaster from Hurricane Harvey and where Congress goes from here. Here's Congressman Dennis Ross on aid for the victims of Hurricane Harvey.
You're not promising to vote for Houston aid.
I'm not promising to vote for anything until I see it. I'm very concerned that we continue to have these natural disasters year in and year out, and yet do we ever take a prospective approach to preparing for them appropriately? So we can't afford to continue these billions of dollars without accountability.
So Congress has an awful lot to think about as it relates to debt and hurricane relief, tax cuts. That's just the start. Congressman Ross will be one of our special guests next week as we drill into the problems and challenges in Washington. Have a good night. We'll see you next week.